Lecture 59, William Blake.
Poet, engraver, visionary William Blake called the God of institutionalized Christianity Nobodaddy, and asserted that Newton's scientific insights, unleavened by poetic inspiration, had produced a world of darkness. For Blake, the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment and its belief in the idea of progress did not herald, as it did for neoclassical writers, the dawn of a new age, but the gradual dimming of the emotional and spiritual light, what Blake called the imagination, that infused the material world with meaning. Newton's single vision, argued Blake, was limited by logic and empiricism. Blake's fourfold vision, on the other hand, found its expression in both verbal and visual forms that pierce the mundane. In this lecture, we will study Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience, published in 1794, deceptively simple yet deeply ironic poems, each illustrated by Blake. The Songs of Innocence represent a world that appears to know nothing of the oppressive weight of social laws or the restrictions of the rational. In other words, Rousseau's pre-social world. The Songs of Experience, on the other hand, represents a world that has been exposed to the corrupting influences of industry and an excessive reliance on reason. The difference between the neoclassical view of scientific thought and reason and Blake's view may be neatly summed up in the difference between Pope's account of Newton and Blake's. For Pope, Newton shined the light of science on the world of nature in an act of inquiry that imitated God's first bringing of light to the universe. Pope says, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Blake, on the other hand, condemned Newton's single vision as like a sleep. The limitations and constraints of an over-reliance on mathematical and empirical reason are represented in Blake's 1795 illustration of Newton, curled in on himself, backed against a rock, measuring reality with mathematical instruments. Newton's science, like Locke's and Bacon's, argued Blake, threatened to deprive the world of mystery, that is, of God, and thus to Blake, these three were satanic. In his rejection of the precepts of order and rationality that typified neoclassicism, Blake was the first major figure in the movement that would be retroactively designated as Romanticism, a term that emphasizes the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the visionary, and the transcendent. Blake lived during a time of revolution and growing political unrest and resistance to the effects of industrialization. From political revolutions in France and America to the ongoing war with Napoleonic France that kept England in a state of unrest from 1789 until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, to the unrest in Britain from workers dispossessed of their land and driven into factories and urban slums, Blake represented all of these experiences in his poetry. He not only lived through these events, but wrote explicitly about them. And the engagement with actual political events is another symptom of Romanticism. Blake was born in 1757 in London, where his father ran a hosiery shop. William was the third of 5 children and went to school only long enough to learn to read and write, and then he worked in the shop until he was 14. When he saw the boy's talent for drawing, Blake's father apprenticed him to an engraver. Blake completed his apprenticeship when he was 22 and was then admitted as a student to the Royal Academy of Arts School of Design. At 25, he married Catherine Boucher, whom he taught to read and write and to help him in his work. They had no children. Throughout his life, Blake struggled to produce his own work, an expensive and time-consuming endeavor. He once estimated that a copy of the combined Songs of Innocence and of Experience would take him about 6 months to finish. And his work was never published commercially. So at the same time as he worked on his own poetry and illustrations, he accepted commissions from others to support himself and his wife. Blake lived and died in near poverty, and was unrecognized except for a few devoted students. Let me talk briefly about Blake's artistic technique and philosophy. Blake's poetry is multimedia, anticipating the technological production of hypertext. The poem is both the words and the image, the text and the design, the voice of the poet and his vision. This combination would produce, Blake believed, a revolution of the imagination. Blake's images do not simply illustrate the poem, but illuminate them, that is, produce further possibilities in the interpretation of the poem. The stress that Blake laid on both aspects of his art is reflected in the title page of the Songs of Innocence and Experience, which gives equal weight to the author and printer, William Blake. For his own politically satiric and poetically visionary works, Blake developed the illuminated book, like the one we will examine in Songs of Innocence and of Experience. For Blake, these illuminated books, a modern version of the medieval illuminated manuscript, were a means of fusing the visual and the literary into a single form. Blake produced his illuminated books in a radically new way, crafting each page of the book by etching copper plates with both the text and the designs in inverse mirror writing with the aid of corrosive acids. These plates would then be used by his wife to make prints, each of which she would then color individually with watercolors. So each version of his book then is a unique work of art. Moreover, the form of the text changed with each successive printing so that there was no perfect text, only the constant process of producing the text, a thoroughly romantic notion of artistic production. Both the manner in which the text was produced and its form embodied Blake's poetic and philosophical principles, principles that were inseparable one from the other. This is how he articulated those principles in his illuminated book, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, published in 1790. The notion that a man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. So the corrosive acid that Blake uses to eat away the surface of his copper plates to reveal the text and design enacts the cleansing of man's perception so that he sees things as they are, infinite. It was also in this book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, that Blake articulated his philosophy of contraries, his insistence on the necessity of both good and evil to life, the necessity of co-present oppositions. He insists that without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. As part of this philosophy of contraries, Blake argues for a reimagining of the concepts of good and evil as they are conventionally understood. Blake distinguishes between what the religious, and Blake means by this the conventionally pious, call good and evil, where good is heaven and evil is hell. In other words, where good is associated with the soul and passivity and prohibition, and evil with the body and energy and freedom. That, argues Blake, is the conventional good, as opposed to the real good, which is the co-presence of desire and restraint, of energy and reason, of hell and heaven. It is this philosophy of contraries, of the necessity for the tension between love and hate, reason and energy, the mind and the body, that infuses the poems in his Songs of Innocence and of Experience. Blake refers to innocence and experience as the two contrary states of the human soul. Innocence is a state of easy and relaxed innocence without the clash of contraries, and experience is a state of suffering and conflicting contraries. One will always be implied by the other. Neither state can exist independently of the other. Let us now turn to some of those poems and see how deceptively simple but deeply ironic they are, as I have said. Although the poems in the Songs of Innocence represent a world of innocence, that is, a world without contraries, they nevertheless contain hints and foreshadowings of the world of experience that inevitably awaits those who inhabit this world of innocence. Although the innocent ones in this world are children, such a state is not tied to a chronological age, but, as Blake says, are states of the human soul, and thus can be experienced at any age. Let me read the introduction to the Songs of Innocence. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, pipe a song about a lamb, so I piped with merry cheer. Piper, pipe that song again, so I piped, he wept to hear. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer, so I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed, and I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs, every child may joy to hear. Notice how the internal narrative of the poem moves from piping to singing to writing. That is, from aesthetic labor that is essentially the same as the body breathing, to labor that can be taken away from the artist. Such a movement is, of course, essential if one is to make art for an audience, but it also inevitably involves a separation between the original vision of the artist and its articulation in poetry. Moreover, the narrative of the child asking the piper, the artist, to make music, to produce art, contains hints of the inevitability of the state of experience to follow. The child weeps. The water is stained to make the ink of the pen. Moreover, in asking the piper to make the same song again and again, the child is asking for a reproducible vision. As the child says, "Tell me that story again," and wants it told in exactly the same way, again and again. But the repetition of past joys is a trap. There is no movement beyond the memory of that original joy, and thus the state of innocence becomes a state of stagnation, of death. The intimation of a state of suffering contained within the state of innocent happiness is also present in the childlike recitation of question and answer represented in the poem The Lamb. Despite the apparent simplicity of the question, "Who made you?" the curiosity of the child portends the adult interrogations that the child will make of his mature world, a world in which the lamb will be made to suffer for its innocence. The child asks, "Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee, gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright, gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee, little lamb, I'll tell thee, he is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild, he became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb, we are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee." The child asks the lamb the same question he asks of himself. Who made me? The answer is produced by a series of complicated identifications between the lamb itself, Christ as the lamb, Christ as the child as the lamb, and Christ as the creating God who made both the lamb and the child. And thus the poem establishes the essential divinity of the human form and being. But we are also reminded in the identification of Christ as lamb that the lamb is a sacrificial animal. And thus the blessing by God that the child invokes on the lamb is not merely a happy thought, but essential to the redemption of both. that both those who cause and those who endure suffering in the world. The child, as an innocent, is unaware of the consequences of his benediction. For the Lamb to become one with the human and the divine, the Lamb, like the Son of God, must die first. The illustration to this poem works to reinforce the innocent reading that the child makes of its world. At the bottom of the page, the child plays with the lamb, a soft and woolly creature, in a scene of rural peace and calm. What does not appear in this poem, or in its illumination, however, is precisely that which gives its meaning, the story of Christ's sacrifice. Only one who knows that story can see both with and through the mundane representation of the poem, in both its textual and visual sense, to the more complex reality it suggests. The companion poem to the Lamb in Songs of Experience is the tiger, a creature, one might say, who mostly causes the suffering of others. In this poem, however, the tiger is depicted as a creature of God as much as the lamb. And so the answer to the question, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Is a resounding yes. Notice that the same images of creation that describe the construction of the tiger, the hammer, the chain, the furnace, and the anvil, can apply both to the work of the rural craftsman, the blacksmith, the ironworker, and the factories of the Industrial Revolution. Blake is once again reminding us that it is human to create and produce, that the real evil is when the machine replaces human activity, not that humans employ machines to create. Moreover, the representation of the tiger as evil, rather than as not the lamb, is a product of human inadequacy. Seen from God's perspective, that is, with the imagination, the tiger is as blessed as the lamb. Once again, the interpretation of the poem is complicated by the illumination that accompanies it. In this poem, rather than complicating our reading as the illustration to the lamb does, the image of the tiger seems to subvert the ferocious representation of the tiger that the poem has suggested. The tiger looks as if he is a stuffed animal. He has a kind of smirk upon his face. Is it intended to represent a perspective that rises beyond the human, beyond the facile distinction between good and evil, to something else? In The Chimney Sweeper from the Songs of Innocence, the speaker of the poem moves from being a child sold by his father to becoming the father of little Tom Dacre, and then both become the children of God, the Father, and must do their duty, that is, sweep chimneys and risk disease and death. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 so your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved, so I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was a-sleeping, he had such a sight, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black, and by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they run, and wash in a river, and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father, and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark, and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm, so if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Tom Dacre's hair is shaved, that is, made unnatural, because otherwise it would catch fire when he sweeps the chimneys. And remember, his hair is compared to the back of a lamb, and so he is sacrificed just as the Lamb of Christ is sacrificed, but of course for very different reasons, economic ones, rather than for mankind's redemption. The dream that Tom Dacre has is of being released from the coffins of black. An angel who had a bright key opened up the coffin and set them all free. Those coffins of black are, of course, literally the coffins that those children will end up in, because they will die a very sad and early death from being chimney sweepers, but they are also the coffins, the chimneys themselves, which the children were forced to climb through in order to sweep. So they live within this world of darkness and blackness. They are suffering the misery of children who are being employed at the ages of 4 or 5 or 6 to sweep chimneys. And their only chance for innocence, their only chance for happiness, is that they should dream of being set free, to dance on the green plain, to wash themselves free of the soot that by the time they are 7 or 8 years old will have eaten away their skin with cancer. And what kind of adult would want to take that dream away from a child? If that is the only dream that these little boys can have that will allow them to escape their misery of their lives and let them become what they should be naturally, which is children at play, what kind of adult would take that dream away from them? Obviously, the transformation of the world that Blake is suggesting that comes from the imagination has to begin somewhere other than in the imagination. It has to begin in a world of economic reality. Economic reality for Blake is the reflection of an imaginative reality. If the world is imprisoned within the coffins of blackness that the children live in, then that world is the world that dominates the imagination, and vice versa. In the companion poem in the Songs of Experience, the chimney sweeper articulates the logic of that world of experience, which is also the logic of that imagination, and that the status quo here is maintained by a hierarchy, a patriarchal hierarchy of God, king, priest, and father, that benefits those in power and authority at the expense of the poor, the vulnerable, and the children. So this is the companion piece to the Songs of Innocence. This is the chimney sweeper speaking, as it were, from a different perspective. A little black thing among the snow, crying weep, weep in notes of woe. Where are thy father and mother, say? They are both gone up to church to pray. Because I was happy upon the heath and smiled among the winter snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And because I am happy and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury, and are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. The child who is happy and dances and sings is, of course, the same child who in the Songs of Innocence dreams of doing exactly that. And because the child behaves like a child, that is, dreams, is possible to be happy even though in a world of misery, the parents, the parents of the chimney sweeper, the father, the mother, the God, the church, all of those institutions that in fact have imprisoned this child, they believe that the child is happy because, after all, he behaves like a child. So we have within this poem then the contrasting image, as it were, of the world of experience, but seen now from the point of view of a child who understands that his innocence is something that is only there to protect him from the misery of the world. Unlike the child in the same poem in the Songs of Innocence, who does not understand that his innocence is a protection from the world of reality, but believes in it as the only reality. In one of Blake's most memorable poems from the Songs of Experience, London, the speaker walks through the city, marking the way in which the architecture of the city replicates the structure of social relationships and the structure of individual feelings in this world of experience and industrialized production. I wandered through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mine-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Notice how everything in this world is marked. The repetition of the word every, in that second stanza. Everything is marked. It is marked in two ways. First, it is constrained, just as the River Thames is constrained within its banks, not naturally flowing. So everything within this world is contained and restricted. But it is also marked by the speaker of the poem. The narrator, who ironically can articulate how the world around him is corrupted by the lack of the imagination, but is unable to see how he himself is imprisoned within those same mind-forged manacles, this is what Blake's term, mind-forged manacles, that he identifies as the curse of this world. The speaker is, after all, the one who is wandering. He is the one who is marking, as in almost one thinks of the marking on the doors during the plague, during the Great Plague in London, where they would walk through the streets and mark the doors with a cross to indicate that here was a case of the plague. One thinks of the speaker walking through the city, marking both people and objects and institutions, almost like the image of death, as it were, claiming these people and these institutions for himself. He marks these things as his because he is the one who carries with him this corrupt imagination, this restricted imagination. He is the one who decides what counts as misery. But perhaps he is wrong. Perhaps he doesn't see the world as it really is, but only as his limited vision shows him. The poem then becomes a kind of Jeremiad, the voice of a prophet announcing doom to a world of his own making. Now we see that in this world of experience, it is not just that the world out there creates restrictions which it imposes upon us. We are not merely victims of this world of industrialized corruption and debased life, but that we ourselves create those very restrictions and limitations that make us feel debased and corrupted. Man limits himself, says Blake, and produces the institutions that deprive him of freedom and life. The institutions that keep him enchained are the same that produce a society that would employ children as chimney sweepers. The church, the military, the monarchy, the state, us. Remember how Swift condemns those who don't act, how Voltaire condemns those who don't act against evil in the world. Blake is making the same argument, not directly for political action, but eventually for political action, but immediately for an act of the imagination, to reimagine things differently. The illustration to this poem seems to completely undermine the picture of the city that the narrator offers us. At the top of the page, we see a child leading an old man to shelter, a gesture that seems to indicate that perhaps the narrator is trapped in a world that he himself has created, because here is a child, perhaps one of those children of innocence, who sees something else in this city, that is the capacity for compassion, the capacity for helping someone else rather than simply marking them. Only then, Blake says, through the power of the imagination, an imagination capable of breaking those mind-forged manacles with a visionary power and a revolutionary vision, can the individual and his society be transformed.